All right, so welcome everyone to Deakin Downtown. My name is Fethi Mansouri and I'm the director of the Alfred Deakin Institute. And I would like to start, of course, by acknowledging that we are meeting here, and also I know that we have colleagues who are joining us on Zoom. We joining this particular event from the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations and pay our respects to the elders past and present, and of course acknowledge any person here who is of Indigenous background. This is an amazing event. We're really chuffed to have such a fantastic panel that my colleague Greg Barton will introduce. It is part of our participations in Social Science Week. It's an extremely important week for social science to be showing to the public the extent to which our agendas, research agendas, do speak to important social, political, and cultural issues. So I will not say more, because I would like just to introduce our colleague, Professor Greg Barton from the Institute, who has been doing a fantastic job really convening and organizing these public policy forums for us. So Greg, over to you. And he will introduce the panel, of course.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Fethi. I will move straight to introducing the panel. Conspicuous by her absence is Professor Julie Andrews. She is on her way. She's stuck in traffic. And I think because we try and keep these events reasonably tight, finishing up at 7:30, rather than lose that time, when Julie's able to get here, we'll hear from her. But we'll start with Gay and Jason. So let me just read some brief introductory comments. There's a lot I can say about each of our three panelists, but Professor Julie Andrews is a descendant from the Woiwurrung people of Melbourne and the Yorta Yorta tribe, and she's been teaching Aboriginal Studies for the last 10 years, but also has extensive experience in policy and Indigenous education. So the overall theme of tonight's discussion is engaging with Aboriginal history and learning from museum collections, art, and teaching on country. And the teaching on country is something that, in particular, that Julie will be speaking to us when she gets through traffic and gets here. She's currently teaching an on-country subject entitled Encountering Aboriginal Victoria Parallel Systems of Knowledge at La Trobe University's Shepparton campus. And she'll be, I think, drawing on that in the work she presents. We'll hear in a minute from Professor Gay Sculthorpe, who has just recently, I said a week to her the other, just now, but it's actually been a month that she's been here, but it seems like only yesterday. I think it probably feels that way for you, Gay, but you're through jet lag and settled into wintry Melbourne. And Gay spent most of her life in Melbourne, but she is a Palawa woman from Tasmania. Hi, Julie. Yeah. And a descendant of the famous singer Fanny Smith, who many of you would be aware of. And the reason I'm talking about her coming back to Melbourne is for the last 10 years she's been in London at the British Museum, where she was curator and head of Oceania and in the Department of Africa, Oceania and the Americas, where she did a lot of work on Indigenous Australian artifacts, tracking them down. She recently put together a collection of what is in the British Museum, and this is a result of a publication called Ancestors, Artifacts, Empire, Indigenous Australia in British and Irish Museums. But she'll speak about that in a minute. And Julie, thank you for braving Melbourne traffic. I've just introduced you, and I don't want to take up too much of the speaking time. But thank you for being here. And Jason, Dr. Jason Gibson from ADI, along with Gay. Jason has worked extensively with Aboriginal custodians throughout Australia, just recently back from fieldwork in Western Australia. His award-winning book, Ceremony Men, Making Ethnography and the Return of the Australo collection, examines the making of one of Australia's most important anthropological collections. He has done a lot of consultancy and research work with government and non-government agencies. He's currently lead investigator on an ARC project called Collecting at the Crossroads, Anthropology, Art and Cultural Change. It's an ARC linkage project working with communities. And this project applies current scholarship on museum collecting practices, art and anthropology to produce a better understanding of one of Australia's most significant yet little known collections of Aboriginal art and culture at the Burnt Museum. And speaking of the Burnt Museum, we had hoped for Dr. Vanessa Russ to join us tonight, and she would have joined us, but she got a schedule for her involvement in an event in Sydney, which has her speaking tonight. So she was apologetic, otherwise would have been here, and we'll hopefully get Vanessa on another occasion, because I know that Vanessa and Jason have worked together through Vanessa's work at the Burnt Museum. Well, it's enough time from somebody inexpert and uninformed. Best you hear from what are three really expert scholars and people deeply engaged in these issues. We are, of course, at an important juncture in Australian history. We hope it's a juncture that leads to positive change, conversations around recognition, respect and reform. And the approach in this forum is looking particularly what we can learn about engaging with Aboriginal history through art, through museum collections, and through teaching and learning on country. So we have a really expert panel to take us on that discussion and open our eyes. I think many of you know more about this than me, but I think others like me are eager to learn from our panelists about how we can better understand First Nations people and the rich history and culture, which for people who haven't been involved like our panelists is often not understood, or it seems to be beyond engaging with, but it's very tangible and immediate. So we said earlier, Julie, that because you were stuck in traffic, we will start without you, so apologies for starting without you. I don't know if you have a preference whether you would like to open in speaking, or whether Gay or Jason go first. This is an informal kind of conversational format. So what we'll do is we'll have some opening statements from Gay and Julie and Jason, and then a series of issues that we'll explore, first of all here, and then very quickly thrown to the floor for questions. Sure, okay. So, yes, sorry, I was going to ask you to do that for us, Julie. Thank you very much.
Just a quick welcome. Hello, everyone. My name is Julie Andrews. I'm a Yorta Yorta and Wurundjeri Woiwurrung descended, and I teach at La Trobe University. So this is, I walked in and I saw Woiwurrung and all the naming of this on this floor, which was really good to see. So on the basis of, I'm hoping you saw those names and the language there, Woiwurrung, and I'd like to welcome you tonight to this discussion here and pay our respects to the ancestors of the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people. We've had a lot of sorry business in the last couple of weeks, so it's really important that we pay our tribute and acknowledge our elders and those who have done the hard work and the hard yards to lay the ground for future generations to come, but also for you to enjoy Melbourne and its cultural connection to its traditional owners.
Thank you, Julie, for that welcome to country. And I'd like to pay my respects also to the people on whose lands we meet, the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people, and acknowledging the passing of people recently, which reminds us of how precious our knowledge and our people are. And to reflect that we're transient, but our lives are all important, and it's great that we are meeting here tonight on this special place to discuss what is really a fundamental issue of importance to all Australians. And I think for me, I'm a Palawa woman from Tasmania, and I've worked out of this country now for 10 years and recently returned. And I'll just say something personal before I speak more specifically about museums. And it's quite remarkable, even in 10 years, what has changed. When you land in Australia now, the airlines say on which country you are landing. And people say, put on their letters, what is the traditional name of the people on whose lands the letters are being delivered. There are so many more public manifestations of acknowledgement of the deep Aboriginal history of this country. And here in Victoria, there have been so many significant developments of a more formal process that I'm not speaking about tonight, with the notions of treaty and truth-telling and the Justice Commission. And while those formal processes do give an opportunity for Aboriginal people to tell their stories, tonight is more about informal ways to engage with Aboriginal history. And it's something that communities can do at all levels. And so my remarks will be about some of my reflections about learning about Aboriginal people and culture and history through museums and museum objects. And I think when I was a young person, it was a very formative experience visiting my local museum in Hobart. And museums are places that many school children go to. So they can be really important in the formation of people's lives later on. And when I could visit the Tasmanian Museum, I could press a button and hear my ancestor, Fanny Smith, singing her songs, which is a really special thing. And many years later, when I worked at Museum Victoria and had been doing some oral history with my ancestors in southern Tasmania, I had come across a small basket in the Museum Victoria collection with no information, except it was given by the school's inspector, Mr. Meston. But when I was doing oral history way back in the 80s, down in southern Tasmania, one of my relatives who lived locally said she had this beautiful basket made by my ancestor, Fanny Smith, but she'd given it to the school's inspector, Mr. Meston. And so just being able to make that personal connection between myself and an object made by my ancestor and how meaningful that was to me, I think that's been one of the driving forces in my museum career, so that museums are full of objects that people don't know about, and they're really important. And there's much work to be done to connect those objects to the right people. In speaking generally of museums, while I do get excited about museums and museum collections, I think it's also important that museums have a history in this country and elsewhere of also being sites of trauma and indirect violence, with museums holding remains of our ancestors who were stolen and placed in museums, as well as other objects. And this has led in recent times, such as the significant move of the Tasmanian Museum and Art Gallery a year or so ago to make a formal apology for their role in that history of stealing Aboriginal remains, and in the case of Tasmania, putting them on public display. So museums have both trauma and excitement. But also museums are, in a sense, a Western institution. And I remember in June Oscar speaking in London in 2015 and consultations around an exhibition we did in London. And June and other people from the Kimberley were saying, museums, aren't really about bricks and mortar. Our museum is out in the country, and what's out in the country is important. And we'll probably hear more about that from Jason and from Julie about learning on country. But it's been quite remarkable how museums in Australia have changed in the approach to Aboriginal history. There was a time decades ago when Aboriginal people didn't have history, they had culture. And even social history is something quite new to Australian museums, which have developed from the 1970s onwards. And since that time, there's been a transformation of museums presenting Aboriginal history. So you have Bunjalaka at Melbourne Museum. You had the great, the Australian Museum, the Unsettled exhibition that was on recently. You've got Bullabardip in Western Australia, all these really important places where people go to tell Aboriginal or can see Aboriginal history. And one of the reasons I think museums can be so important is that people might go to parts of museum serendipitously. They might be going with a family to see one thing, they'll get lost and they'll end up in the Aboriginal section, then they'll learn something. And so they can attract people who are directly or indirectly interested in Aboriginal history. It's also important, I think, if you look at museums and the way they deal with Indigenous history, where that museum is located, whether it's a local museum, a state museum, a national museum, or an international museum, such as the British Museum. And when we were preparing in 2014-15 to do a major temporary exhibition at the British Museum, which was called Indigenous Australia Enduring Civilization, we did some audience evaluation because it was going to be a paying exhibition, and then the normal part of the process to say what would people be interested to see. And the discussions in developing the exhibition and hearing what the audience focus group said was quite remarkable. And things like, I remember one member of the focus group said to us, I wouldn't want to, he was an English person, I wouldn't want to pay to go and see an exhibition which told me how badly my country treated other people. Yet, on the other hand, Aboriginal people and Torres Strait Islanders we were talking to in Australia were saying, you've got to tell the truth about Aboriginal history. So in that exhibition, we did try to walk a line between both those things. And one of the most pleasing things for me in doing that exhibition was not only seeing people from all countries of the world, seeing some of these objects that we take for granted, like boomerangs or buck paintings. Some of the visitors had never seen any of those before. And then also, but seeing these Aboriginal objects, some old, some really new, on display in the heart of London was a very powerful thing. And for all the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who were there at the opening, I think we all felt very proud that here at last, in this imperial centre, you had such an ancient civilization at the core of the institution of the British Museum. As well as museums as institutions and presenting exhibitions, museums also hold amazing collections of objects, many of which aren't well known. And I'd just like to just mention a few objects that have had important places in my experience of museums one way or another, some directly and some indirectly. Perhaps the most important, as a museum curator, the most important acquisition of an Aboriginal object that I had a hand in acquiring goes back to the 1980s when I was working at Melbourne Museum. And it was then that was the time that the Aboriginal funeral service needed a new hearse. And then through discussions with the people who were involved in the community funeral service and the museum, I proposed to the museum that the museum buy the hearse. So the hearse used by the funeral service came to the museum in the mid-1980s, or late 1980s, 87, I think. And it's just been, as an object, I think it's even got more importance now than what it did at the time, because some of you might know that that hearse was used to take back from ANU the very ancient remains of Mungo man and Mungo woman. And more recently, it's been used to take a significant person back to country here in Victoria. So I think that's the most amazing object that I've probably had the personal involvement in. Another, also through objects, through looking at objects in museums, such as bark paintings or Western District or Western Desert paintings, the stories that those artworks tell also tell deep histories of the country of Australia through paintings of ancient dreaming and creation sites. And in the stories of some of the bark paintings in Arnhem Land, the stories of the Macassan fishermen who would come down from the north. And in other forms of contemporary art, such as, for example, Wanyee artist Judy Watson from Queensland, some of her work reflects really strongly on objects taken away from country. And she did a beautiful art book based on an exhibition called Skullduggery, which reflected on the taking of human remains from her country in northwest Queensland. And they were, some human remains were sent by a matron of Burketown Hospital to Sir Henry Wellcome in London for his medical museum in the early 1930s. And she beautifully used those letters as the basis for a very powerful artwork. Just one other example I will share with you tonight was when I visited the Ulster Museum in Northern Ireland. And I saw there one of the most powerful opening statements of an exhibition I've ever seen in my life as a museum curator. And as you would know, Northern Ireland has the history of the Troubles from the 1960s to the 1990s. And the curators of that exhibition about the Troubles went to great, they had a lot of community involvement, there was still lots of discussions, but one of the phrases on the opening text was, we have a shared history, but we don't have a shared memory. And I think that's something that we can apply here in Australia, because there's a shared history, but the memories of the events that have happened in our land are remembered very differently by who you are. And so I think that whether it's coming together, such as places of commemoration, such as Myall Creek, or in Queensland, the Battle of Meeway near Toowoomba, and being on country and people sharing their different perspectives of history through museum exhibitions and getting everyone to share their story and perspectives, I think is a very powerful thing that people can do to learn more about Aboriginal history and respect everyone's approaches to that and increase our understanding. So I will leave it there.
I'm going to go next. They're both museum. Got some questions here that you gave me. So yeah, just a little bit about myself. I'm Director of Indigenous Research at La Trobe Uni, but I've got a history there of about 30 years now of teaching, developing higher education policy at La Trobe. For you that don't know about our campus as a university, we have 4 other campuses at Bendigo, Albury-Wodonga, Mildura and Shepparton, and I teach across all of them. So a lot of those campuses, all of them, even Bundoora, have the highest Aboriginal populations in the state. So we've got a lot of jobs to do in terms of increasing awareness from primary and secondary education to higher education for both black and white students in those areas, in regional campuses, as well as Bundoora. So a lot of the work that I do is about teaching and learning. I've been convener of Aboriginal Studies for about 10 years at La Trobe. So I teach and supervise HDR students as well. My topics are usually on Indigenous education and Torres Strait Islander topics. So I really like to see Aboriginal studies have more HDR research topics. You might be wondering why. And that's because I think when you're competing with disciplines like science and education, teaching, archaeology, anthropology, sociology, a lot of them need, even social work, a lot of them need the cultural awareness behind those subjects for their students. They're not going to get it. A lot of our students want Aboriginal people's knowledge to teach them. And I think one of the things you were talking about here in this, in these questions you gave me, was what did we learn in school about Aboriginal history? And when I first started teaching Aboriginal studies, probably about 3 or 4 hands went up in a lecture room of 700. Thankfully, this has changed. Now more and more students are saying that they know or have friends that are Aboriginal and they have met Aboriginal people or went to school with one. So the awareness of non-Aboriginal students is increasing, which is going to help our kids, Aboriginal kids, not feel so isolated and conscious of themselves and make them feel welcomed and included. These are the things that our people have to struggle with, even as parents and grandparents, getting their kids to school to make them feel like they're welcome at the gate when they walk in there, so they'll go back. So one of the voluntary work that I do is a director on Opening the Doors Foundation, where we fundraise, and I don't have to do much of that, thank God, but they, there's, I don't know how they do it, but they get all this money in, and that gives us the opportunity to buy school books, school shoes, uniforms, music lessons, sporting activities, and trips overseas to play, soccer and rugby and footy for our kids in Victorian schools. Makes a big difference. Going to school in the right uniform. Now you see all those ads on, about all these poor kids, walking in the class, and haven't got the right uniform. Well, our kids have been doing that for a long time. And we know the statistics about Aboriginal people, the hardship, the economic hardship, low employment, incarceration and deaths in custody, domestic violence and drug and alcohol addiction. Huge, huge factors. Affects all our families. Suicide as well. So if you've got kids going through an Aboriginal family and they have to get up after each, trauma, and Gay was talking about trauma in museum, but we've got everyday trauma for our kids and they have to go to school. So we do the best we can and trying to lessen that and make them feel included. So when I teach on country, I talk about those issues with my students. I take them out to Shepparton and Barmer areas, but it's like an immersion program where I take them into Aboriginal organisations where they actually get to speak to Aboriginal workers and people about the programs that they're running to help with all these kind of social issues that our people have to deal with. And I take students that have got social work or psychology backgrounds. They can be anybody. It doesn't really bother me anymore by the time they get to third year. They should know something about my people so they can help open the doors for my people to come through, just like they got an education. And if we're talking about welcome to countries and living on country and knowing country, that's what my students get to understand and appreciate the respect that is involved in living and working and walking on country. So when I run my on country subject, and I was just working on that today, actually, getting ready to go out, it is hard work. Getting ready to go on country. It's not just easy the way the university will just, put everyone in charge. No, that's got to come through me. I've got to train staff. I've got to inform them, culturally make them aware of what to do when engaging with Aboriginal organisations and community, and they won't speak to them anyway, even if I do train them. Because they want to talk to an Aboriginal person, right? And they want to talk to someone where they don't have to educate. And they want to talk to someone who they know. And that's how it works on country, that you need to know your kinship networks, and I teach my students that, the big family groups, the big family names that we've been accused of having nepotism about. You wouldn't get much work done if you didn't know your kinship in that community that you're working in. Because if you don't know your kinship, you won't know the law, you won't know who's fighting with who, and you don't know who died, and you don't know who's got the problems and the history, and you're not able to engage. And it's very important to engage with Aboriginal people. Many of them have had trauma, and they know when someone is real, and they know when they're honest, and they know when they're gammon. And you would have seen Lydia Thorpe talk about gammon in Parliament this week. Gammon means bullshit. So if you're going to go into an Aboriginal community, they can see you coming. You're not the first white fella that's been there. And they know how to work you, and they know if you're green, and they know if you're a good fella, or they know if you're, poor fella. You know what I'm saying, don't you? Yeah. So, but when I take my students on country, a lot of them have a life-changing experience because I take the elders and the elders talk to them and educate them and teach them about themselves. And that's what's different when you go on country. You're actually learning about yourself. And we talk about racism. They get to hear the racism that Aboriginal people have to tolerate and live under, those kind of stories on Yorta Yorta country, in the Barmah forest, you know, the problems, the stresses around running Yorta Yorta, you know, country as traditional owners, but having to come up against loggers and the fight against, you know, brumbies, you know, the misunderstanding of what cultural heritage legislation means. So my students learn all about cultural heritage legislation and the Yorta Yorta native title claim that was failed. And they learn about the Murray River and the Murray Cod, and they go on a cruise, and that's our classroom on the water. And then we go out onto Cumragunja Mission, and we listen to all the trailblazers' history that set up everything on Cumra and then come to Melbourne and set up things here. But before they get to that cultural knowledge of on-country learning, they've got to go through the Shepparton community first. And once they get on the Shepparton community, that's where they start to look at Rumballara Football and Netball Club and the football, how sport is a empowering, inclusive thing for our kids and adults as well. But they also go to Rumballara Co-op, which is where our health programs are, women's programs, drug and alcohol, our medical centre. They sit around, we go in there and they can sit around and see who's in there, talk to whoever's in there, and they always talk to the students. Then I take them into the elders, Rumballara Elder Centre. See Rumballara everywhere in Shepparton. I don't know why they kept up naming another Rumballara. So yeah, so we go Rumballara Elders Centre and all our elders are there. And then the students can walk around and their mind is ticking over constantly. Here are these programs that are in place for our community, and we got all these students that are being trained in all these degrees and so forth, but none of them have this kind of community feeling and knowledge of how to live and work within a community, because we don't have that in Melbourne. Everyone's separate, everything's too fast. Took me ages to come down Collins Street there in the taxi, got out and had to walk, but that's all right. But, you know, that's what we have to live in our society and understand our society as well. So this is what on-country learning is about, what it means to live on country, how spiritual healing comes to you being on country, the cultural teachings from your elders, but also learning art. So we go to Sam Shepparton Art Museum, and I book a class for my students. They go in and learn weaving off the elders, that kind of thing. We're always doing hands-on things, but they're exhausted by the end of the week. But, you know, and they've got it, you know, up early and out, you know, lectures about drinking and alcohol and all that kind of thing, and how it's one of our big issues in our communities, and they've got to acknowledge that and, you know, be respectful when you're in our community and on country. So we separate the women from the female students from the male students. I have male elders come in and lecture, and I have female elders come in. And then I have the youth, because our youth do not have a voice, they're marginalised. So if they're living in Shepparton and they're faced with ice every day, they've got kids, they have kids by the time they're 17, 18. It's about teaching my students about the social dynamics of what's going on in Shepparton Aboriginal community. And if you've heard or listened to Briggs, the rapper, he raps about all that stuff, you know. He says, he makes one song, you know, Father's Day, no one knows who their father is. So that kind of thing. it's like, but everyone else does. They don't know, but everyone else knows who your father is. So this is that thing around living in an Aboriginal community with kinship networks that are so entrenched. And that's what the Yorta Yorta community is about, kinship. So there's 16 family groups that are under the Yorta Yorta nations. And because of those 16 family groups, everyone knows their family tree and their history. So that's what it's like being on country. And we do this, and I organise that, you know, it's a lot of work to take people on country. And it's a lot of work, whatever our, you know, Aboriginal people do, like Gay, it takes a lot of her cultural knowledge, history, family, everything. We are doing it because this is something we've grown up with, but we've been able to apply it in the workplace. But it is about, you know, we are actually giving something of ourselves over when we're educating people, particularly on our country. We're going to have questions.
Yeah, I think really that's a really
Okay, so I'm the white fella on the panel. First, I just want to acknowledge the people of this land. I acknowledge you, and I acknowledge your countrymen, your country, and your ancestors. Yeah, one of the questions that was put to us by Greg early on when this panel was being planned was, what did you learn about Aboriginal history when you were at school? And, you know, recently I went back over my school reports from, I think it was grade 4 or 3 or something like that. And I was actually very surprised to see that there was quite a lot of Indigenous content in there. Drawings of Indigenous people. Sure, it was romanticised, it was idealised, but there was a sense of humanity in there as well. But, you know, I grew up on the outskirts of Melbourne in a working class family, and my world was pretty small. In time, though, I came to learn more, and I've had the privilege of engaging with Indigenous Australia and its history through historical collections, but also through collaborative work with Indigenous people over the last 2 decades. So this combination of collaborative research and dialogue and working with people on country has been, you know, really rewarding to me individually, but I think it's a really important methodology as well that we could all learn from. That spirit of working with people. There's an anthropologist who talks about reading history with people rather than reading over their shoulders. That spirit of collaboration. So whether it's when I'm working in Gippsland, Bega, Alice Springs, Perth, Alcuda, Belgo, or anywhere else, the approach is kind of always the same: to engage with deep Aboriginal history with Aboriginal people. And for me, that separation of Aboriginal history from the present is just so problematic. I think it's a trope that we still deal with in Australia. The indigeneity and Aboriginal history is a thing of the past. And I think there's still so much to be learned about what that history means for us here in the present. And you can't really think about history without really engaging with people today in the present. So I think it's kind of a false dichotomy in some ways. As a museum anthropologist, I've had the privilege of working on a number of really important early anthropological collections that were made about Aboriginal people from different parts of Australia. And in those collections, yeah, there's terrible stories of exploitation and appropriation, mistreatment, but there's also the kind of unanticipated stories of dialogue, negotiation, great agency, and pride, and a demonstration of cultural pride. So as an example, I worked with the Strelo collection, which is a collection of, well, it was made by an anthropologist in Central Australia in the mid-20th century, and he worked with hundreds of Aranda men in that area over 40 years. And in that collection of song, ceremony, dreaming, mythology, place names, an enormous, amazing collection. And when I first came to that collection, you know, I could see how remarkable it was. But many of the people who worked with that collection at the time thought that contemporary Aranda people really didn't have much to offer in terms of an interpretation or knowledge of that history or those songs or those ceremonies. And being familiar with some of the local people in the area, they started to come into the office and ask me, what's in this collection? What's there? And very slowly, after over probably a decade, we would just work through that collection methodically and find the right families in the kinship network to connect different parts of the collection to the right people, introduce different parts of the collection to different people. And in a very slow and meticulous process, we were able to put pieces of that puzzle back together again. So in the end, it was quite evident and so obvious that Aboriginal people had so much to offer. They had the cultural expertise, the social background, the knowledge of the history to really make sense of that collection, far better than I could have or any of the other expert curators who were working on the collection at the time. So I think that methodology, working collaboratively with people on history today, is just so important. The men that I sat with and worked through that collection, they had complex versions of history, different ideas about how and why the collection was made. They call it the Strelo collection after the anthropologist that made it, but in fact, it was equally made, if not more so, directed by the Aboriginal men that worked with Strelo. They were really calling the shots. They orchestrated the making of that collection in so many ways. As Greg indicated last week, I was out doing fieldwork as well, and I was working on another anthropological collection that was made by the anthropologists Ronald and Catherine Burnt, again in the mid-20th century. And when I first started looking at that collection with Dr. Vanessa Russ, who was meant to be with us here tonight, a Gidja woman from Western Australia, she said to me, this Birrindudu collection, a collection of drawings, 800 crayon drawings that were made in 1945, no one's ever looked at these before. These drawings that are sitting in the museum have never been back on country. They've never been shown to people what their ancestors, these old men in 1945, had drawn onto crayon paper for these anthropologists. So we've started a project, and last week I was out with 9 Jaru men travelling through country with copies of those drawings that we've taken from the museum, printed in large format, trying to find the places that are referenced in those drawings in the landscape. Many of the places that are mentioned in the drawings, people don't really visit anymore. So we're actually using that museum collection to revisit country, to using the notes and the information that was provided from those elders, re-story that country in a way too. But it's a process that's being driven entirely by those men that I'm working with. My job is really, and this is my passion, is to find ways of getting that material to the people that really have the expertise and the personal connection to these objects, to really make them shine, to make sense of them. And it's only through that process that can be done. It's through those experiences that I've come to see Aboriginal collections, museum collections, while they primarily belong to the people that they're about, I think they also offer something for all of us. And they certainly offer something for me personally, and I've learned a great deal. There's shared histories, and I really like Gay's point about shared histories, but also different memories. I think that's really great. There's mistakes in these collections. You can see the mistakes, you can see the successes. There's important information about junctures in history. And there's experiences, I think, that we can all learn from. So in terms of engaging with Aboriginal history, I think museum collections, regardless of their origin really, have so much to offer, and there's so much more work to be done to bring those stories to the fore in Australia.
a couple of quick questions for our panel, but I'll quickly throw open to the floor in just a minute. Let me catch up a little bit, and I should acknowledge that I said that Gay had joined us a month ago, so she's taking up a chair here at Research Professor of Cultural Heritage Museum Studies at Alfred Deakin Institute and in the Faculty of Arts and Education at Deakin. And just yesterday, if you don't mind me saying, Gay was awarded the 2022 Global Australian Award for Global Impact in recognition of her work in First Nations cultural preservation and promotion globally. And that, of course, is framed from the work she's been doing for the last decade in London, the British Museum, but also now thankfully coming back and engaging here. What's changed with museums, Gay? I mean, are they getting better at recognising the things that the three of you have been speaking about? Are they helping us move towards beginning to have a shared memory? And how whichever's maybe the microphone might be better here, but yeah. We should, let me, whilst Gay comes here, I'll go and look for a mic.
So have museums changed for the better? I think that's the question. I think there's been a lot of change, but I think there's still a long way to go, because if you look at the staffing issues, for example, the range of positions held by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in Australia now in museums is really broad. They're on boards, advisory committees, curators, directors of programs. But I think, like, they work in museums that are underfunded, not valued in society, and people have great ideas with these institutions about what needs to be done, but there's still such a long way to go. Some of you might know that the Australian Museums and Galleries Association commissioned Aboriginal lawyer Terry Janke to write and consult with people for an Indigenous roadmap for museums between the 2019 to 2029. And I don't think all those targets they've set out are going to be met. And it's full of aspiration and goodwill, but in terms of inventories of Aboriginal cultural objects, that's not being done. There aren't still enough Aboriginal people on boards of museums. There aren't enough Aboriginal museum directors. But at the same time, there's pockets of great work being done, people interpreting their own culture in local keeping places and on country like a Budj Bim, Western Victoria, amazing work being done down there. But I think in spite of the greater attention to Aboriginal art and Aboriginal people in museums, there needs to be far more support for programs and for even more staffing and support. So it's not just project driven, but ongoing funding for really enduring transformation and legacy.
Thank you, Gay. That's it's partly hopeful and partly a lot of hard work to be done. And thanks for the hard work you have been doing so far. But obviously, we're sort of closer to the beginning and the end in this process of work. Julie, I wanted to ask you a question. I mean, you've been working across the spectrum with students on country, in classrooms, but also, yes, and research and policy development. So looking at Indigenous curriculum development, I wanted to ask you, what do you see as the main development so far in Aboriginal Studies curriculum, and what needs to be done? Where do we need to? I'll pass the mic to that.
It gets back to employment, like Gay says, you know, like for a long time, I was the only Indigenous academic at La Trobe, and I had to teach 3 subjects as well. That's a lot of work when you have community responsibilities and you've got to visit those campuses and engage, so you know what to develop for your curriculum. So curriculum is very important, that you're on the ball with what you are teaching. Some of the subjects that we offer with Aboriginal Studies, I think you need to be diverse. So politics, culture, you know, women, art. There's so much of the diversity in our community and our people that we need to, Aboriginal Studies needs to reflect that. And you're going to get research that's going to also reflect the diversity. And I think we need to you know, grow that more, because I think what I see now, even with your research, it's, you know, it's Strelo. I mean, you're still working with Strelo collections, so it's just, you know, it's not like it's stagnant.
And you must have seen a tremendous amount of change at La Trobe through the work you've done. Are you optimistic that sorry, with the microphone to you?
Yeah, I seem to get pulled into strategy building, and you too, Gay. That's what they use Aboriginal minds for, is our input to advise them on where the weaknesses are inside a university. So that comes from getting through a understanding and communicating what weaknesses are, but getting them on board to understand their real weaknesses, and that can be changed. So, of course, like we've just done an Indigenous strategy at La Trobe University, and that's incorporating various challenges around recognising that racism still exists in the university. You know, a lot of people don't believe they're racist, and they don't know what cultural safety is for Aboriginal people. So using different terms and getting to educate the staff and take that on board is, I think, important for an institution that's large, like a university, particularly when they don't realise that they might be offending Aboriginal students and staff and community and elders, and they might be going out to do research or representing the university. They need to know how to speak to people, but also how to implement the Indigenous strategies that their workplace has on board, like reconciliation action plans, for example. Some people don't like them, other people do. Things are changing, you know, so you need to be on board with what other people, what their thoughts are as well. Use one.
Well, yeah, thanks. I'll pass the microphone to Jason. I'll ask Jason a question. Thank you. Yeah, so yeah, respect is vital, but respect is better developed with knowledge, right? So it's an experience, and that learning is not just book learning, right? It's on country as well. To
engaging,
yeah.
Communicating. Yeah.
And if Vanessa were here, she would be speaking about art, which we've mentioned in the title. She was the first Indigenous director of the Burnt Museum in Western Australia. But Jason, you mentioned some of the work you've done together. What can art and contemporary art, Aboriginal art, tell us about Aboriginal history? I mean, how can we learn history through art today?
Yeah, well, I think if Vanessa was here tonight, she'd have a very different answer. So I can't speak on behalf of Vanessa, but from my learning with people, I mean, it's quite obvious that Aboriginal art, you know, my experience is in Central Australia primarily, so I can speak about that to some degree. But you know, in terms of history, we're talking about firstly a foundation in, say, for Aranda people in Ulupna, in the Dreaming. So those paintings that people produce, or for the Western Desert in Dhulanyagan, so, you know, it represents the dreaming. It represents an internal presence, stories that created the landscape. So if we want to talk about history, we should probably start by talking about those ancestral stories that shape the country that we live on. And Aboriginal art does a great job of communicating those stories in using a visual language that comes from Aboriginal Australia. And then, you know, I spoke about the Birrindudu drawings that we're working on at the moment, and they were produced 26 years before the rise of, you know, the dot painting movement, for want of a better term, in Papunya in 1971. And these drawings, they depict not only those ancestral stories, the stories of creation of the country, but histories as well. So in some of these drawings, we have stories of, for example, a pastoralist shooting people at a place called Mount Brophy. And this is documented in a drawing in 1945 by a stockman living on that country. An important part of Australian history that not many people know about, and more people should know about. Yeah, so I think, you know, Aboriginal art has so much to offer in terms of the different layers to Australian history, and
as I said, it's kind of it's a visual language that has emanated from Aboriginal Australia. So I think it's extremely effective in telling stories.
Thank you. And I don't know, Gay, whether you want to add anything on that particular question of what contemporary artifacts or art and art tell us about history and the link between ancestors and the present through objects.
I think Jason has given quite a good answer to that, so we might open it up.
Okay, yeah, and good point. We've sort of only got half an hour, a little less. So I've got a couple of microphones here. I'm sure that there are questions. There's a whole lot of questions in my head, but I won't take more of your time and the panel's time with my questions. Better to hear your questions. So, yep. I'll pass the second microphone to somebody else.
Thanks, Greg, and thanks, panel. Hi, Gay. My name is Tom Molyneux, a proud Gunditj Maraman from Woodbim. Thanks for shouting that out. I wanted to ask you a question, and it picks up on something Jason mentioned in his talk around not getting stuck in the idea that all this is from the past, that it's a historical thing only and that culture is actually living. And I think Tasmania has some way to go on this as well. But I was interested in your thoughts specifically around museums and in the way that they're set up and the way they're perceived, I think, by a lot of the community. A lot of the time we walk in, we're expecting to see lessons about history, and particularly around the way Aboriginal stories and our culture is represented in museums. I think it's often framed in the past. So how do we help museums not get bogged down in that, and that it all being historical and that the culture is alive?
In one way, I think there's quite a simple answer to that question. Employ Aboriginal people, and people will tell their own stories using their own relations and family and land. And I think just people's living concerns will influence what they do in museums. So I think while the historical past is relevant to learn and reflect on, I think the more staff you have in different areas of the museum, whether it's digital, customer service, interpretation, education, curators, all different areas, I think it's just really a matter of more Aboriginal staff, and people will tell you their stories or communities' stories as they feel is appropriate. But they need resources and support to do that, given, as Julie said, people who work in particularly larger institutions get burdened with many other things as well as their usual direct responsibilities.
Hi, Andrea. It's not on. No. On now? No. Yes, it is on. Gay, I was interested if you could tease out something you said in your set of comments around the fine line, the tightrope that you walked at the BM in terms of developing an exhibition that didn't make people feel guilty, but at the same time acknowledged a difficult history. Can you tell us, can you share a little bit more what the actual strategies were there? Because I think that is such an important problem to understand and develop strategies around. And there may well be also lessons in the classroom from that.
Yeah, that's an interesting question, because I think I've seen exhibitions at Melbourne Museum and other places where there are very direct representations of, for example, massacre maps, and that can be quite confronting. And I know when I visited Bullabardip in Perth in June, the way that was presented as one example, and I'll get back to the British Museum in a moment, there was a warning at Bullabardip before you entered a certain section of that gallery to warn people that the subject matter was going to be difficult and people should be prepared for that. So I know some museums, if they have like permanent exhibitions, may provide a space for people to take time out when they're visiting the exhibitions, because whether they're Aboriginal or not Aboriginal, people can react strongly to things. But more particularly, I think during the process of the doing our exhibition at the British Museum, we were aware of that. What level of knowledge did the local and international audience have about Aboriginal society and history, and in dealing with the traumatic things that did happen in Australian history. So I think we tried in, I guess, the broad marketing of the exhibition to focus on some key objects that told diverse stories, so that we wanted people to come to the exhibition. We wanted people to enjoy parts of the exhibition. We wanted people to, we were aware that people would see some confronting things in the exhibition, but also it was sort of partly an emotional journey that they were ending with a very positive thing at the end. So I think also trying to be clear in some of the information we presented, Aboriginal voices, museum voices, so that we tried to tell a story that was, I guess there were different levels of difficult conversations throughout the exhibition, but overall we wanted people to leave with a positive message. And in the audience evaluation, of people who had visited the exhibition, what was a common thread was that people said they came away wanting to have further conversations. So we were presenting this as, in the introduction, we said, this is an ongoing story because there are loose ends still to be worked out. And by saying at the end of the exhibition but for visitors, they wanted to have further conversations and learn more, I think that showed that the exhibition was quite successful in presenting some difficult stories, but at a level where people were prepared to know more and didn't disengage. Yeah.
Thanks. Emma? Oh, over there. Yeah, I've just got a question for Julie, kind of following on for that about how non-Indigenous people's history kind of interact with the way they engage with Aboriginal history. So just wondered, in your experience of teaching, whether international students versus Australian-born students, and also in kind of white students versus non-white students who are non-Indigenous as well, like what kind of diversity, or do you see any diversity in the ways they engage with Aboriginal history that you're teaching?
Hey Emma, haven't seen you for a while. That's a good question, because we're in a very changing climate in this country with racism, truth-telling, all the political, stuff that's going on in Victoria and Canberra. So what that means in the classroom is that we're getting students that are coming not from being naive anymore, they're coming with a political agenda now. So in Aboriginal studies, we got to put up with people that, want to see Jacinta Price on the referencing list, we want, there's people that have white fragility issues where they see their whiteness is being challenged and their rights are being removed. So, and these people enroll into Aboriginal studies to come and voice their objection to what's going on in the country, because they feel they've got nowhere else to go to do it, unless you get locked down and you do a big demo like we saw with some of those people that had no idea what they were demonstrating about, but they certainly weren't Aboriginal. But it becomes down to white rights. We're seeing a lot of that now in Aboriginal studies, where we've had students come and, I've spoken to colleagues where they've had the Ku Klux Klan come and enrol. So, you guys would be very, very surprised because you're here for a reason. But when I take my students on country, there's a lot of racism that they get to hear about from non-Aboriginal people, about Yorta Yorta people, and that's good because you need to uncover the layers of racism for people to understand how entrenched it is in this country and to feel that they are in a privileged position in this country compared to Aboriginal people. Now, because we're in Bandura, we get a lot of people that are the first generation that are getting an education at university level, a lot of Muslim students. So we're getting, people that have experienced hardship. So when you're dealing with people in a learning environment, you have to cater to everybody. So I take that situation in the classroom as a gem where I can teach someone to understand something from a different perspective. And that's what we have to do as academics and lecturers, is to show different ways of learning and understanding and applying thought to a situation. And that's what a good researcher is too, looking at things in different perspectives. So if we can teach people how to position themselves in situations where they're uncomfortable, that's going to produce really good people for this country in the future, particularly the younger generation. One of the things we talk about a lot at La Trobe, and we've championed this through our Indigenous PVC that passed a few years ago, his aim was to have La Trobe decolonise the curriculum. So having that focus of decolonising the curriculum meant that we could challenge people's views, but also have the hard conversations around what white fragility is, what white privilege is, and looking at how this society is empowering others and not, and forgetting the others. So this is a responsibility that universities have to have, that hard conversation about what the outcomes are going to be for their students to take forward with them to make this country a better place. So when you're teaching Aboriginal studies, you have to, well, that's my job, is to not shy away from the racist viewpoints that they learned from their families, and we teach them that on country, and they actually break down and cry when they're on country because they start to see where they went wrong. And then they see how their grandmother or their mother is treated as a woman compared to the way we treat our women in our society, our elders, I hear the students say a lot, I can't believe how the elder men respect the elder women when they speak, and they sit there and they don't cut them off. I'm so used to people in my family telling the mother or the women to shut up. You don't do that with black women, Yorta Yorta women, or any, you do that. So the students get to understand equality, and that kind of thing. That's important.
Question here. I was just thinking the provocation I think that Greg threw into to open up the conversation about what we had known about Aboriginal people at school, and I was thinking my experience I think was somewhat similar probably to Jason's, a certain amount but not a lot. But one of the things which does seem to me quite notable is the pluralisation. So when I was at school, it was very much a very stark kind of division between Aboriginal and white or Western. And we're much more conscious now, I think, of Yorta Yorta, Palawa, Woiwurrung, Bunurong. There's a kind of sense of a bit of plurality of Aboriginal peoples and experiences and places in the country, and that's reinforced constantly through acknowledgements, and we've got had a lot of it on during the pandemic period in Zoom and Teams conferences, where you have people introducing themselves from different parts of the country and talking about where they're coming from in terms of the local people. And I think there's been a little bit of a kind of loosening up too in the ideas of the West as a singular thing. And if you get into the more academic debates here, there's a sort of increasing sort of awareness of the pluralized, you know, that the West is not a singular thing. It's quite there's a whole lot of tangled threads, and the Portuguese, Spanish Empire, the British Empire, and so on, they were quite different. So I just wondered if you had any reflections on how the kind of breaking down, if you like, of that very stark Western Indigenous opposition, how that's changed the game a little bit in terms of Aboriginal histories.
One of the things I would say is that even the plurality amongst Aboriginal people acknowledging their various different ancestors. So depending on who you're talking to and the situation. So, you know, I have Aboriginal ancestors, I have English ancestors, I have Irish ancestors, and people often refer more commonly to the variety of their ancestors. And I think while it's true that there is more acknowledgement of and about particular groups, what I look forward to is the day when they are so well known, and that each nation that exists in this country, all those names on the map, like Tyndale's old map, that are reconfigured in meaningful ways today, that all the different Wiradjuri Nation, Yorta Yorta, etc., while the names are used, but they're given the proper recognition and status and the substantial progress towards dealing with the unfinished business of unceded lands. So there's a long way to go.
Yeah, I think there's probably more drilling down to be done too. I think that's probably great as a first step, just to acknowledge, you know, the language group from which you're speaking or whatever it might be. But we can go so much further in terms of, you know, the specificity of place relationships, place names, acknowledging families that is from certain areas, whatever it might be. I just think there's still so much more that can be done in that space, just to acknowledge the complexity of those relationships too. Like you're saying, Gail, like that, you know, I think people having multiple relationships to, you know, language identities, also acknowledging the other kind of place and person relationships that are at work.
Identity, you know, it comes back to identity, not skin colour. We're getting back to the old way of looking at what defines an Aboriginal person, and that's still here today with our people, how much white blood they've got in them, you know, that kind of thing. That's quite hard for our young ones when we teach them to be proud of themselves. And then I hear people say, why do we have to say what blood we got in us anyway? You know, white fellas don't have to do it. You know, how come black fellas have to do it? You know, I know my family kinship, my lineage. I know who my grandparents are, my great-grandparents. Why do I have to, you know, be challenged all the time just because someone doesn't know my family? They're looking at my skin colour. So, you know, it's quite, you know, like you're saying, it's entrenched and you've got to drill down a bit. But yeah, it comes to, you know, knowing your family. We look at stolen generations, they have a hard time trying to find their family, who they are, what country they're connected to. You know, they're locked out of, you know, native title, everything. They're the, you know, ones that don't have anything. But there's all these kind of issues around identity and who's in and who's out.
Kia ora, ngā mihi ki ngā tangata whenua, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou. Ko Nina toku ingoa. My name is Nina. I'm the Rare Materials Cataloger at the State Library, and I have a background of working in museum libraries before this. And in the work that I do with documentary heritage, I come across a lot of, for example, auction catalogues which have Aboriginal or Indigenous artifacts listed, casually somewhere in the middle, or, a book that's been annotated by an ethnographer that has some field notes in it. And these are things that in standard cataloguing practice wouldn't be recorded. So I was wondering, from each of your backgrounds, looking both at a collections perspective, but also at supporting research and scholarship, what's something that you find that you've wanted to see in documentary heritage in this area that you find missing at the moment?
Well, I'd like to see everything on the database to begin with and digitised. And then you can drill down from there. Unless you know what's there, you can't begin to explore it further. And so museums, libraries, digitise within some core protocols.
Yep, make it discoverable. Working with communities in the NT in Western Australia, people have got no idea of what records are out there that relate to their families and their communities. So just make it discoverable. I was talking to someone about this in Alice Springs a little while ago, and they just said, we just want everything. We just want to know everything that's out there. So yes, Gay's right.
That's good.
Yeah.
Look, as a white fella who has a long museum career behind her, I stand in the position that I'm learning. I'm still learning. I will always go on learning, and it strikes me that this is something that museums manage to skate over. That putting on exhibitions, doing the core business of museums in a way, isn't enough. I do feel that museums have a special burden of reparation to Indigenous culture. Well, I should probably say cultures, plural, because they have been the caches, the representations, the image of Indigenous cultures, the public front in colonial and imperial contexts. I think exhibiting, interpreting isn't enough. Maybe this is too much, but are there ideas that occur to you or tracks that occur to you for taking museum knowledge out further?
I think what Jason is doing is the sort of thing that needs replication, because museums exhibits are often for non-Aboriginal people, not always, but principally. And it's all the collections in museums that need to be discoverable, reconnected, and whether it's through digitised photographs, copies of drawings, whatever. I think often people like Jason and others who work in museums scramble to get a small bunch of funding to do a little project, and then the project ends, and then that sort of finishes. But there needs to be sort of core funding so that work is continuous, and so that curators just don't do exhibitions, like when it's a big new museum development with building funds, but that the core business of this is called museum business that needs proper museum resourcing to enable it to be done on an ongoing and systematic fashion.
Yeah, I absolutely concur. I just think that the ongoing relationship between communities and those collections and the institutions that hold those collections really should be central core business to all museums in Australia, acknowledging those relationships and doing the hard work that's required to keep the doors open, to keep those relationships working. And there are many museums in Australia that are really well intentioned and do a great job, I have to add. But Gay's right, it's not properly resourced, and it isn't really seen as core business. But I think those ongoing relationships between community and collections have to be central to the future of museums. Otherwise, give it back. Yeah, yeah. Well, give it back as well. I mean, we can have return. We can have digitisation.
You can topic for another public policy.
We'll have another one on that topic.
Can I add now, having heard your entirely sensible and obvious responses, that I was, of course, speaking from the point of view of a white fella. That is the majority of the visitors who come or hear of. Is there further outreach that museums can do? Or is that just asking too much?
No, I think it's, I think museums should be expected to be working with communities in this day and age. I don't think that's asking too much. And in terms of, the propagation of give it back, well, in terms of some categories of objects, that's been going on for a long time, and there's been some good work done in that area. But it isn't just it shouldn't just be a matter of simply returning objects. It needs to be a process of open return of knowledge, access, make things discoverable, and an exchange of ideas between museums and communities. So much good has already come of that kind of work. And there's so much more good that could come through that kind of work as well.
I don't know whether Julie, did you want to?
One thing you got to understand, not every Aboriginal person's the expert on everything. So, that is good.
But it does seem like you've got part of the puzzle there in that the work of museums, and I'm not somebody who works in museums, but I'm getting to learn a little bit, is in this area particularly, is not just the artifacts that are held and the records of them so we can find them, but the relations with community. Without the relations with community, all those artifacts by themselves, it's only half the potential.
I can add to that.
Please do.
Yeah. It's about, building those partnerships with Aboriginal communities to strengthen research and knowledge. So it's also about, understanding and learning off each other, but knowing where the knowledge has to stay. So, not taking it away with you. And one of the things that Yorta Yorta will say, whose knowledge is it? Whose archaeological sites is it? So all that kind of stuff that, you see, and you commented that everything that came to the Strelo collection was with the men behind it. So I think people have to understand that what's in the museum isn't just belonged by the museum, and when you're doing research, and one of the research I'm doing at Dhulanyagan country, and it's on women's bushfire knowledge, burning. It's also Lake Bort and understanding possum skin things and the water and the way it's been changed by colonisation. All that kind of stuff is interesting, yeah, for sure. But there's a story and history, ethnography that has to come with it. And that is to explain why there's no Aboriginal people living there now, if they're traditional owners and that's their land. And so we've got to find out forced migration and how it's come to be that Aboriginal people end up on missions and then they left there and it became owned by farmers and all that kind of stuff. It's engaging with the history of the country, but also in different formats and understanding what happened, not just massacres, but, forced migration. That says a lot to me when I do my research. Where's the knowledge gone and what's happened to it? But when I go on country, there's always, every year, no doubt, and this is going even with Budget BIM and everywhere around, the Victorian Aboriginal community is excelling in language. They're getting their language back. They're getting their art back. They're getting their land back. They're getting everything back, and with that comes spirituality and engagement with the country and knowledge. And that's when they start going to the museum to see what's there. And then they engage with that and link in with that. And that's where I see the beauty of cultural knowledge growing and blooming for Victoria. We were the first ones to be colonised, besides Tasmania, sorry. But, you know, the hardship that we've had to experience of explaining why we're Aboriginal, how we're Aboriginal, I think, you know, has it's starting to turn here in Victoria as we start to engage with our Aboriginality, but also being legislated in the Parliament for truth-telling and treaty in line with our Maori brothers and sisters, and kia ora to you, I forgot to say that. So, yeah, it's that kind of, I say to my students, the past, we are living in the past, but the present is with us still. You know, so to engage and understand Aboriginal studies, you have to understand where you are in the past and how it affects us in the present, and vice versa. The present is in the past as well. So we're always addressing and fixing up what's occurred in the past as a result of colonisation.
Thank you, Julie. That's a really beautiful note to conclude on. I feel bad about concluding, but we're sort of out of time, and we'll come back and do this again, I hope. But the kind folk here won't be happy with us if we don't go home reasonably soon. But this is just the beginning of a conversation, right? It's like we just be getting into things. There's so much more to discuss. And Gay, now that you've joined Deakin, ADI, I hope that we can have more conversations like this. We have these public policy forums, as some of you know, 4 times a year, roughly. And I hope one of the ones we have next year can return to some of these things and pick up this conversation, take it further. We have one public policy forum coming up in a month's time. So Thursday, October 13. And you might be aware, October 12th, if you think about it, 2022 is 20 years on from the Bali bombing of October 12th, 2002. And so on October 13, we're going to have Roger Noble, who's the Ambassador of Counterterrorism, come and speak to us. And sort of reflections of what's happened over the last 20 years between Indonesia and Australia. I mean, there's a lot of tragedy and sorry business, but also some hopeful cooperation. And he'll be joined by an Indonesian colleague who's worked in this field, and another colleague, Kacha, who's expert in what's being done to try and prevent the cycle of radicalisation and rehabilitate. So that's Thursday, 13th of October, back here, same place, same time. Thank you for coming tonight. I know it's not the easiest night to come out, and it's sort of wild and windy and wet out there. But it's been a really fantastic conversation, and it's much too short, but that's the nature of this structure. So thank you for coming, Julie. And I know that Vanessa would be here if she could be, and so we'll reach out to her again and try to get her. And thank you, Jason. Am I being too naive to say that you've left us with a note of hope, that there's optimism about?
Definitely.
Yeah.
We're going to get through this. You've got to get through it all together.
Well said. Well said. Thank you.